for reading. The bishop or the priest would get out an old manuscript, read a couple of pages, and that was it. There was no sermon, there was no preaching in all of our churches throughout Egypt. In all of Egypt at that time, there was only one eloquent preacher and teacher. His name was Father Philithaus Ibrahim Baghdadi, a very important figure that you should get to know a little bit about. And Habib Girgis later in his life learned so much and would go and meet with him regularly and benefited from his eloquent teaching. Sometimes his sermons went for 3 hours, and people were not bored because they were thirsty to hear of the Word of God, and they couldn't find anyone to teach them. Even the churches were overflowing, and people were standing around the windows of the church with the windows open to hear his message for them today. He went throughout all of Cairo, Alexandria, all the way down to Aswan, having spiritual revivals, teaching and caring for the spiritual needs of the Copts. But imagine, what is one priest going to do amongst the millions that were there? But this was the state of the Christians at that time. Any questions? Okay. Have I lost you yet, or are you with me? Okay. Habib Girgis was canonized as a saint by the Coptic Synod on 20 June 2013, along with Pope Kyrillos VI. They were canonized on the same day. And so more interest among the Copts began to develop. Who is this Saint Habib Girgis? We don't know much about him, and people began to want to know more about him. So heightened interest within the Coptic community. In the picture here, you see his relics, and he was wearing his diaconate vestments, his clerical vestments. His relics were found in the family tomb, which was known where it was, and taken out and moved to Mahmasha, which is a suburb in Cairo, not far from the cathedral. And this is where he did all of the work for the theological college and for Sunday schools centered there at the seminary. And so it was appropriate then that the relics would be returned back to Mahmasha. The church he had built back in the early 20th century had, deteriorated, was knocked down, and a new church was built, and the relics are there. If you ever go to Egypt, make sure you get the opportunity to go and visit the Church of the Virgin Mary in Mahmasha. I was lucky in January 2014, as I was completing my doctoral research, that Bishop Martyrus kindly gave me part of the relics to take back to Melbourne. And so here are some of the relics that were presented to me. But let's have a look briefly at his life in a nutshell, and then delve a bit more deeper into his work in Sunday schools. I probably won't have enough time to go into the work he did for the Theological College, which is also very fascinating, but let's see how we go with time. He was a prominent educationalist. He was a reformer. In fact, in 1942, he wrote a very important book about how the church could reform itself in a period of 10 years. And he put like 8 or 9 different chapters of important things that can be reformed in the life of the church in a period of 10 years. He was also a writer. As I mentioned, he wrote about 30 books. He was also a poet. So he published 4 volumes of hymns for the children in Sunday school, where he could teach them the doctrines of the church in a very simplified way. and using Coptic music, because Western music had already come into Egypt through the missionaries. So he used the hymns or the music of the Tasbihah, of the midnight praise, of the Qiyah praises, of the Lent hymns, etc. He used that music and then adapted the words that he wrote for each of the hymns, and he began to teach this to the children in Sunday school and also others for spiritual meetings in the churches. He was certainly an eloquent preacher, and he had a very powerful voice that when he spoke, he grabbed the attention of his audience very quickly, and they were very attracted to hear him preach and teach. He was also a trusted advisor to several popes, but in particular, Pope Kyrillos V. Pope Kyrillos V was the longest reigning patriarch in our history. Do you know how many years? 53 years. So he was quite elderly when he passed away or fell asleep in 1927. But he was the personal disciple of Pope Kyrillos V, but also worked under three other patriarchs, Pope Ioannis the 19th, Pope Macarius III, and Pope Euseb II. He was also the founder of the Sunday School movement, as someone mentioned earlier, and he was then appointed as the dean of the seminary in September of 1918 until his repose in 1951. He was born in 1876. We don't know exactly the date, but does anyone know when he fell asleep in 1951? It's very easy. Once I tell you, hopefully you will remember it every year. Yes?
August 21st?
Yes. Why is August 21st? Why should we remember this date? Because the following day is what? The feast of St. Mary. Yes? 22nd August. So the day before is the day which is the feast of Saint Habib Gerges, 21 August 1951. So hopefully you can remember him on this day and seek his blessing. So here you see, born 1876 in Cairo and fell asleep on August 21, 1951. His father was from the city of Tema in Upper Egypt in the south, and his mother was from the city of Al-Bayadeya. Both of these cities were part of the directorate of Gerga at the time, but now part of the Suhag governorate, if anyone knows that region. His father, Gerges Mankarios, worked as a chief clerk in the most important government departments associated with the interior administration during the reign of Khedive Ismail. He passed away in 1882 when Habib Gerges was only 6 years old. So imagine a young child with all of these difficult circumstances we're talking about, loses his father at such a young age, would not have been easy. His mother, Miriam, continued the mission of raising him along with his other siblings. He had 2 brothers and a sister. Ghali, he died relatively young as a youth, and his older brother's name was Kamel, and he had a sister called Martha. And she raised him in a Christian manner, and she enrolled him in the great Coptic school where he excelled in his studies. He was an astute student and very interested to improve his education and to seek the highest possible levels of education that he could. His mother was sick most of her life. She was bedridden. There's even a photo of her, sitting on the bed. She must have had some sort of paralysis or something like this, but she still gave importance to his education. He was also one of the first students to join the seminary or the theological college when it was established in November of 1893. Pope Kyrillos V saw that the state of his clergy was very poor, lots of problems that were taking place among clergy at the time, and as I mentioned, the most important, lack of theological education. So then he decided in November of 1893 to establish the seminary in Cairo, and a person called Yusuf Bek Mankarios was appointed as the first dean of the seminary. But he would gather the students, that first class that Habib Girgis was in, you get some manuscripts and get each of the students to read something. But unfortunately, the first 4 years of the seminary, there was no teacher of theology or religion. Imagine this. So what were they teaching them? They were teaching them geography of the Bible, history, mathematics, science, all these different subjects, except for the most important subject, which is theology and religion, and this is why they joined the seminary. So some of them, they just left, and they just got frustrated. But Habib Girgis had a character that was tenacious, and he was resilient, and didn't give up easily, even despite the many difficult obstacles that he met along all of his career. So what did he do? He went into the library of the Patriarchate, which was a very rich library of resources, of manuscripts, of books, and he began to read and research. And he writes this in one of his books. Until he had read everything in that library and researched it. And so when he was so advanced, the dean, Yusuf Bek Mankarios, then appointed him few months before his graduation to teach the first year students that were coming new into the seminary. So being at the top of his class, Habib Girgis was chosen to teach at the theological college while in his final year as a student, because there were very few teachers to teach theology. Any questions? Yes. Anyone? Am I going too fast? Yes.
About how much reading material of manuscripts did he have to be able to go through?
Yeah. As I mentioned, that library was a very rich resource. So there was, thousands of manuscripts and books in there, and he just kept on reading and reading and researching until he had read everything in that library. Yeah. And that's how they then allowed him to teach, when they saw how knowledgeable he was. Any other questions? Okay. The first lecture that he ever gave was when he was still a student at the seminary in 1897, and he gave it at the Great Coptic School over 2 Sundays. And it was titled The Christian Religion, or Ad-Diyana al-Masihiyya. And he split up his lecture into 2 parts. The first part, he began to describe to his audience what the early church of Alexandria looked like. And he began to speak to them about how St. Mark came into Egypt in the middle of the 1st century and preached in Alexandria and began to convert people to Christianity. He began to speak to them about the age of martyrdom and how our church stood strong in the face of Roman persecution and under the Emperor Diocletian, and how hundreds of thousands lost their life. He spoke to them about the age of monasticism and about St. Anthony the Great and St. Macarius, etc. He spoke to them about the great doctors and pillars of the church like Athanasius and Cyril, and told them this was the glory of the Coptic Church in the first 5 centuries, and how the Coptic Church led the world in theological studies and in the ecumenical councils in Nicaea, in Ephesus, and in Constantinople, etc. This was the first half of the lecture. The following week, he then says to them, "Come now, let us look at the dismal state that we have reached and this period of darkness that we are currently in. Let us now put our hands together and begin to revive the Coptic Orthodox Church again and return it to its former glory. In attendance at this lecture was the editor-in-chief of a famous newspaper, Coptic newspaper at the time, called Misr, or Egypt. And his name was Tadros Bek Shinoud al-Mankabadi. And he took permission of Habib Gerges to take this lecture and to publish thousands of copies and to distribute it to Copts all over Egypt, that they may read what is written here and begin to work together to transform again and revive again the life of the Coptic Orthodox Church. The second lecture he gave was at the Coptic Church in the suburb of Haret al-Sa'ayin in Cairo. And by this time, Pope Kyrillos V had heard about this bright, eloquent preacher. And as Habib Gerges was about to begin his lecture, he finds Pope Kyrillos V walking into the church. He comes and stands on his papal throne, and he begins blessing Habib Gerges with his cross, blessing the people coming to listen, and felt that a great revival in education is about to take place through this bright young preacher. And then he took him on, he ordained him as an archdeacon, and he became the personal disciple of Pope Kyrillos V. And in this icon, I don't know if you can see it clearly, but you can see at the bottom left this image of Pope Kyrillos standing there with his cross blessing him. And then on the right, Habib Gerges is in the seminary. In front of him is his desk, his writing utensils and ink pad, and he's teaching the students at the seminary and writes on the board one of his famous sayings: education is the first need for the community after bread. Education is the first need for the community after bread. This is how much he saw the importance of education. Any questions? He graduated in 1898 and was appointed to teach full-time on the 17th of March the same year, 1898. He was appointed the dean of the school on the 14th of September 1918 after Yusuf Bek Mankarios, the first dean, had passed away, and he remained in this position until his death in 21 August 1951. He also opened evening classes for university graduates at the school in 1945, but unfortunately, the Majlis al-Milli, or the Lay Community Council, which was a group of lay elite people that were appointed by the government to assist the Patriarch and the Synod in the administration of the church, clashes took place between him and them several times. And unfortunately, they shut down the evening classes, and he was very upset about this and sent them letters, saying, how can you do this? How can you stop this important work? And unfortunately, very shortly after this, he was paralyzed, and he was bedridden until his death in 1951, and felt this bitterness that he could not fully achieve everything he wanted, because he wanted this seminary to reach international standards, and he did everything within his power, but unfortunately lots of resistance against his work, that those around him could not see the importance of what he was doing, and so it led to his paralysis, unfortunately, and eventually his death. His dream was to see the theological school reach world-class standards. This is a famous picture where you see him as an archdeacon, probably before or after a liturgy where he was praying with Pope Kyrillos V. He was ordained an archdeacon, but was not ordained as a priest. Pope Cyril V trusted him and appointed him as his personal deacon and disciple. and also worked closely with three other patriarchs, Pope Ioannis XIX, Pope Macarius III, and Pope Euseb II. I already mentioned this. You can see also in the photos that are coming up how elegantly he was always dressed, with a tie or a bow tie, with a suit, and with the fez or the tarbouch. So this was the standard back then. Even the students themselves, you see many photos of him with many of the students or lecturers at the seminary, all dressed very elegantly all the time. I mentioned that he was the chief editor of a religious, moral, and historical journal titled The Vine, or El Karma, and he published 17 volumes of this journal, were issued over a period of 25 years from 11 September 1904 until the last issue in 1931. Well, there's more than 17 years there, so what happened was some of the years he couldn't publish because he didn't find the funds to be able to do so, and eventually he had to stop publishing this important journal. But he went on to publish more than 30 religious, theological, educational, and historical books, along with many sermons and educational studies. In 1900, after the Coptic Synod had issued a decree 2 years earlier in 1898, and Pope Cyril V the following year issued another decree about the importance of religious education for children, and then another decree by the Pope in 1903 similarly. He then, and this is one of the picture of one of the booklets of curricula that he had published, المبادئ المسيحية الأرثوذكسية للمدارس الابتدائية, تأليف حبيب جرجس. So elementary curriculum that he had published. So he began with a very simple method, with a catechism, Q&A, question and answer. Who is Saint Mary? She is the Theotokos, the Mother of God. Who is the Lord Jesus Christ? He is the second person of the Trinity, etc., etc. He gathered groups of children in St. Mary's Church in Fagala in Cairo around the year 1900, and he began to teach them by memorization and rote learning this catechism, to teach them the basics of Coptic Orthodox faith and Christian faith. And then later you'll see he then develops this curriculum to be much more advanced after this. He was also chosen to be a member of the General Sunday School Committee, established in 1918, and in 1927 he was chosen as the General Secretary of the same committee. So many consider the formal beginning of Sunday schools to be 1918 with the establishment of this General Sunday School Committee. But for me, I see he began this work much earlier, around the turn of the century, when he began to write this simple catechism and began teaching it to children. But formally, the Church recognizes 1918 as the formal date, and in 2018, there was a large celebration remembering 100 years since the formal establishment of Sunday schools. Questions? Yes. Yeah. So one of the mentors he had was Father Philithaus Ibrahim Baghdadi. So he would go meet with him regularly, learn from him many things. So this was one of his mentors. Then obviously spiritual direction he was getting from Pope Carolus V. But he was a person that was always thinking outside of the box, right? So he didn't just sit there and say, okay, What can I do? Okay, there is a decree from the Synod, there's a decree from the Pope, importance for educating the young. Who am I? What can I do? He never thought this way. He always began to think outside the box. What could I do to begin this process? How to encourage those around him to come and to see the importance of this. So he was unique because no one else was doing the work that he was doing, right? And then he let or allowed the students at the seminary to assist him in writing some of this curricula under his guidance. So he did quite a bit, and that's why he was unique in his time. And that's why Pope Shenouda calls him a light in the darkness, because of this important work. Because sometimes I think to myself, if the Lord didn't send Habib Gerges at that time, what would have happened to the future of the Coptic Orthodox Church with the influence of the Protestants and the Catholics that were there and trying to infiltrate the Coptic Church? But he stood like a lion in front of them, teaching Orthodox faith, and he didn't just teach it to children. This is the amazing thing. He searched for every single Copt everywhere in Egypt. And hopefully you'll see in a little bit what I mean by this, because he developed curricula for everyone, not just for children, for tradespeople and blue-collar workers. He did a Bible study, scriptural study, 4 pages every Sunday. Family would come to church. They take the new Bible study with passage to read, questions. They go home with their family, or that was what was hoped would happen. And then they begin to study and read, come back the following week and get a new lesson. He also cared for the people in the villages, in the far villages that were in terrible state, right? Because, first of all, there was no churches in the villages. The cities were too far for them. They couldn't afford to go to the city. Some of them did not even know they were Christian. Some of them were not even baptizing their children. And he began to send the university students that were Sunday school teachers down into these villages to care and to look after these people. We'll talk about that in a few moments. Does that answer your question? Other questions? How are we going for time, Abuna? We still have time? How much? Okay. Just remind me, because I will. He also did something very interesting, which was to introduce popular education. What do I mean by popular education? One, the liturgy. When we come into an Coptic Orthodox Church, or any Orthodox Church for that matter, it engages all of our senses, right? The incense, prayers, going up to heaven, the icons. And we learn from these people that were a light to the world and lived saintly lives, that we may learn from them. We hear the hymns, and the hymns have deep impact on our spirits, etc., etc. So this was one type of popular education that you didn't need to be able to read and write to be able to be fully impacted by the liturgy. Second, he imported from Europe religious pictures of all of the stories of the Bible in the Old and New Testament in beautiful color photos. And he began to distribute these to the Sunday school branches, so that the teacher, when they are teaching a particular lesson, they have the picture and they describe the picture to the students if they don't know how to read and write. And then they would have a booklet for like 3-month period, where every week they would put this picture in the book so that they can go back and refer to it and remember what the lesson was about. On the back was a verse and a summary of the lesson for those that know how to read and write. For those that don't, then the picture itself, as we say, tells 1,000 words, so they could learn so much from this. He trained its teachers and convened conferences for them, as well as writing a constitution, a fundamental law, he called it, for Sunday schools, where he mentions a lot of important matters that the teachers should be aware of as they are teaching, and also how to establish new branches, etc., etc. He also gave importance to sports, leisure activities, social trips, and clubs for the young. All of this we find in his curriculum. As I mentioned that he was a poet, this is one of the books that he wrote, النشيد أرثوذكسية وترانيم عقائدية من نظم حبيب جرجس مدير المدرسة الإكليريكية. So this was one of the booklets of hymns that he had written. And was elected 3 times as a member of the lay community council with the highest number of votes. He was also nominated several times as bishop and once as patriarch, but was rejected from the synod because he was not from the monastic ranks. And also 2 important conferences that he had for Sunday school teachers in 1941 and again in 1949. We mentioned his death on 21 August 1951. The church had lost one of its most revered sons, an eloquent teacher, a visionary, an educational pioneer, and a loyal servant of the Coptic Orthodox Church. So let's talk more about his work in religious education. He had an innate love for learning, despite only completing a post-secondary diploma of theology, a belief that education would lead to reform and maintaining Coptic identity. He was very big on this issue, how to maintain Coptic identity amidst all of the disturbances that were happening around him, from pressure from the government, pressure from the Western missionaries, and also an internal struggle that was happening inside of the church. A clash took place between Pope Carolus V and the Majlis al-Melli, the lay community council. It led to the Pope being banished to Baramos Monastery for a period of 6 months. Imagine all of this, and now the Pope, on top of all of that, is removed from his see and is sent to Baramos Monastery. Imagine a church without its head and all of the difficulties that the church would have faced during that time. So maintaining Coptic identity was critical to the work of Habib Gerges. Yeah, so these 3 matters were tearing away at Coptic identity. This photo is in the 1940s when he was much older. In Egypt, before the time of Habib Gerges, education was done through what was known as the Kutab system of learning, which was a memorization method. So a blind cantor would gather a group of children in the foyer of the church, teach them to learn by heart some of the Psalms, some of the Gospels, some of the letters of St. Paul, etc. And the Muslims were doing a similar system for their people as well. But 7 November 1867, a law took place that ended the Kutab system and its integration into the modern school system. Because the Westerners disdained this Kutab system and this method of learning by memorization and popular education, and they preferred the textbook. But I still believe that there is place for memorization and popular education in our teaching in the church, still has value. I will skip over this because of time. But Habib Gerges advocated free education for all, including the poor and the illiterate. So he didn't just look for the elite and the rich people. He wanted education to reach everyone. And he also wrote a very important booklet called Iftiqad al-Qarya, or Visitation to the Villages. This rural education booklet reminds teachers of their duty towards the marginalized people. This is what he says, I quote from him. "For this is a simple matter that does not require more than our feelings toward those members in the body of Christ whom we neglected for a long time, to be knocked around in their darkness, left to stumble in their ignorance, and to perish as sheep with no shepherd." So he's saying this to the religious educators. We cannot continue ignoring, this important part of our people and our community, and they've been left in this darkness for a long time. It's time that we take action to care for them. And he writes this booklet with many, many details of how education in the villages should take place. So he worked to combat illiteracy and help train blue-collar workers and also tradespeople. And here you see in this picture with him sitting in the middle, maybe the picture is a bit small, historic photo with some of those that were ordained to one of the ranks of the diaconate. So he aspired to teach children fundamental truths of their faith, to instruct them in history, doctrines, and rites of the church, and lives of its heroes, the saints. And he trained them to sanctify Sunday, because many people were not coming to church on Sunday. They were not partaking of Holy Communion. So he speaks to them about the importance of partaking of Holy Communion regularly, how to lead a Christian life, how to prepare them to be useful members of their church and nation. So he was a nationalist, not only caring that they should be useful members of the church, but what impact can they have in the community around them. He also established the Coptic Youth League in 1918. This is our modern Coptic youth ministry led by the Bishopric of Youth and His Grace Bishop Musa, right? Back then it was called Jamaat Shabab al-Qibti, or the Coptic Youth League. And he sought to confirm youth in their faith, consolidate their spirit of unity and general fraternity, engage them in spiritual, cultural, social, and sporting activities, to train youth to embrace virtue and combat vice, carrying out charitable and social projects to benefit church and community, and encourage youth to confront the dangers that targeted the unity of the church both internally and from external forces. He also played a role in introducing religious education to the state-run schools, not just for the Coptic schools, but Copts were sending their children to state-run schools. They were only teaching Islamic religion. He gathered the Christian teachers in these schools, trained them, and then his curriculum was approved by the government in order to be taught in state-run schools as well. I already spoke about these three things, the popular education. This is an example of one of the religious color pictures of one of the scriptures. This one is of the Good Samaritan, and he writes a summary of the lesson on the back. Any questions? So we come to this, the visitation of the villages, and we may have to end here, but this is only slide 28 of 49. But don't worry, we won't continue all of it, but it's just to tell you that this is only one PowerPoint presentation. There is another long one about his work in the seminary, but we won't get to it. But let's finish with this visitation to the villages. So what he did was, during the 3-month holiday, university students would serve the villages. How? He would tell them, go to the government census office and get the information about where the Copts are living, because they were doing a census regularly. and in particular focusing on the work in the villages. And then he says to them, before you go on your trip, and he would send them 2 by 2, go to the central office of Sunday school. And there I found in the footnote a message he gives to them. He says to them, pick up the books about the life of Christ using the Laubach method. And I read this in Arabic. I had no idea what that was. Laubach, what is this? So I tried to write it in English letters and Googled it. Thank God for Google sometimes. First thing that came up was this person called Frank Charles Laubach. He was a Protestant missionary, American, who was sent to the Philippines to what were known as the Moro tribes. And the Moro tribes were illiterate people. They couldn't read and write. So he devised a system called Each One, Teach One. Those that know how to read and write to teach those that they couldn't, using the life of Christ as the example. So he's hitting 2 birds with 1 stone. How? Teaching them to read and write, and then preaching to them about the life of Jesus Christ. These books had come to Egypt. Either Habib Gerges brought them in, and they were obviously translated into Arabic. And so the teachers were to take these books as they were going to the village, because in the villages, hardly anyone could read and write, and would say to them, find 1 or 2 people that could read and write to teach the rest of the village using these books. Great idea. But I think the problem he would have met is actually finding 2 or 3 people that could read and write in the village that could teach the rest. So 2 go together. When they enter into the village, they split, each one to visit 10 families, to take with them a picture of the Lord Jesus Christ and hang it in their room, because their houses were very simple, maybe 1 or 2 rooms at best, lots of poor conditions. Sometimes they were living with non-Christian families together. Very difficult. You can imagine the difficulties that they would meet. They would give them a religious lesson, and then in the evening, the whole village would gather together for a spiritual meeting. They could discuss with each other what were the religious lessons they each learned, because it would be different in each house. They would leave with each family 1 of the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But obviously the issue of reading would have been probably non-existent. And then he set up a regional office somewhere where each of the teachers could report back to this regional office all the problems that they could see in each of the households, so that this regional office would take on these problems and try to find solutions for them. So you see how he was willing to care for even these poor people in these remote villages, because there were no priests going to the villages, and he would tell them, take the holy altar board, go into these villages, pray liturgies for these people, take their confession, give them spiritual teaching, because they could not afford, or was difficult for them to go into the cities. Now, of course, there is many churches in many of the villages throughout Egypt, but that was the case back at the turn of the 20th century, that there were no churches in the villages. So you can see how he cared for everyone. He even cared for female education. So you see this picture here of him sitting in the middle, or in the 3 people in the middle, he's to the right, with a group of girls from Sunday school in Zaazit in Egypt. And this is what he says about his care for education of women and girls. He says, as for the ministry to girls after the age of 10, so before the age of 10, boys and girls were together in the classes. After the age of 10, they are to be cared for by women who would conduct their meetings at different times from the meetings for boys. The male Sunday school teachers and the members of the Coptic Youth League are not to interfere in or oversee the ministry to girls, Women are to set the suitable activities from the Coptic, apart from the Coptic Youth League, which was only boys, and the higher committee is to set up a special organization to supervise and direct the ministry of young females. So you can see, he cares for the children. He cares for adult education. He cares for those in the villages. He cares for female education, for every aspect of the Coptic community. Habib Girgis looked after them. I've gone over the 8:30 by 1 minute. There is still a lot to go through, but if you have any final questions, I'll be happy to try and answer them. But for me, every time I speak about Saint Habib Girgis, I feel inspired. I feel that he was a saintly man who had always the Word of God in front of him, open, reading it. I actually have his Bible. I have his actual Arabic Bible with some of the marks that he used to put in it. But when you look at this Bible, you see how much he was using, not in a good state. So I have to be careful how to preserve it. I also have his English Bible as well. But he's an inspiration to my life. I love him very much, and he's certainly someone, especially for those that are religious educators here, to seek his intercession and be inspired by him and never to lose hope. No matter what is the situation, he always tried to find a solution for everything as much as he can. Any questions? Yes? You can ask one or two and then the rest after we conclude. But raise your voice a bit, please.
One of the things that you mentioned is how he emphasized popular education, particularly literature. So you mentioned how some of his talks and writings were about the importance of religion. So were there certain things that he emphasized to teach people about the liturgy, or how else did he bring people to the liturgy?
Well, he wrote about this, that that the liturgy is central to all of our Christian life, and began to encourage parents to bring their children to the church and to partake of Holy Communion. He wrote very clearly about this. And then in some of the lessons that he wrote for the curricula, he would write lessons specifically about the liturgy as well. So that's how he spoke about the liturgy.
Something like in Sunday school now, we still do the same exact practice. It hasn't changed at all. We have a booklet where we add it to it every week. So what is it about that practice that you think has made it last this long?
Yeah, I guess it's, as I mentioned, it's easy to look at a picture. When you have all the icons around the church, you look at an icon and you learn so much from it. So that's why he was using this. But I think now today there is much technology that can be used. So sometimes I wonder to myself, if Habib Girgis was living today with all of this technological advancement that we have, what he could have done with all of this. It's, back in his time, these religious pictures that he was importing at first from Europe, but then began to print in Egypt. In one of the reports that he wrote in 1948 for a period of 9 months, the population of Copts at the time was about 1 million.